One of the big things that we're really kind of going to focus on for November is where we're really going to focus on prepping for the winter. This is one of as we're very aware of with today, we're starting to see some cooler weather. We're starting to see some dormancy with plants, hopefully, and hopefully even a little bit of some fall color. Though this is not necessarily consistent. This is actually a few pictures that I got last year, which had much better fall color in November. But you might still see some. Probably the one that I see the most consistent really is the Japanese maple in the middle. But occasionally you'll see other ones that can strike some fall color in the air, which can make it actually feel like fall outside of the weather. But generally, we're not seeing a whole lot of that right now. What we're really seeing are plants dropping leaves a little early. We're seeing plants kind of trying to figure out what the weather's actually going to do, which is pretty typical for us this time of year. But that being said, what is currently happening? So there are still some perennials in bloom, though a lot of our exciting ones from last month are starting to finish up. We are still seeing most of my asters are still in bloom. In fact, I've got asters and gaillardia blooming at the exact same time. And so that's kind of nice to still have some of that. Of course, most of your salvias are still in bloom if you've had those in the ground all year. I am starting to see some plants go to fruit, especially some of our ilex species, things like yopons. I'm even starting to see some of your savannas, dahoons, other tree form hollies starting to put on some berries as well. This is very good to see. We want to see this for the birds especially, but also because that kind of gives it that winter feel once we start seeing those holly berries coming on. And of course, one of the exciting things, probably one of my favorite things for this time of year, though it's only sasanquas, you are seeing camellias starting to bloom. Which is always, again, it's one of my favorite flowers, not just the sasanquas, but the japonicas especially, though those are still a little ways off. We'll probably see those more next month in January. We are starting to see some dormancy happen, though we'll probably see that more towards the end of the month. And even some of our shrubs will start to put on some fall color, as you can see with this blueberry in the left picture, which was actually planted with that kind of fall color already going on to it. We're not seeing very much fall color yet, but hopefully we'll start to see some kind of really make it feel like it is fall. As I said, still seeing plenty of flowers in bloom. One of my favorites being, of course, the George's Savory, which is a little bit lesser known perennial that does extremely well in this area. That is actually a picture from the other day. It is just absolutely going crazy. Of course, asters are still in bloom as well. And then, of course, I've got some spreading chrysanthemums, not necessarily your standard mums you get at the store, but those, of course, you can still get for fall decorations. That's one that's actually a perennial that I have in the ground. But that one is, of course, doing fairly well. So I still have something blooming. There are still things to enjoy in the garden, but really, some of our shrubs are starting to put on some flowers as well. Your Turk's cap, which is in the middle, that's a type of, or it's related to the hibiscus. Those are just absolutely going crazy, which is a little surprising. I generally see those earlier, but hey, take it when we can. Tea olives are still, some tea olives are still in bloom, though mine is kind of finished up for the year. I still, every once in a while, get a whiff of that fragrance, though again, not super showy, still very enjoyable. And of course, if you have any encore azaleas will probably be blooming again this time of year as well. But really, the showstoppers are beginning to come out, and that's going to be your Camellia sasanquas. Though I'm not seeing as many yet, it's kind of the beginning for them, and so it's very exciting. Whether it's your Shishi-Gishiras in the middle or your Minano Yukis on the right, there's a lot of different, or the Yuletide on the left. There's a lot of different Camellia sasanquas to enjoy, and of course that pretends for the Camellia japonica, which we're really going to start to bloom a little bit later in the year. So really the big question, obviously, as we will all have, is really what to do in the garden. And as I kind of said, there is still plenty to plant. And I really encourage people, get out there, make sure you're getting your trees and shrubs in the ground this time of year. Don't wait until next spring, because generally that's not going to be, you're almost a little bit late on those. Most of your perennials, you're either have already gotten them in the ground or you're getting ready to. I'd hurry up on those. It's a lot easier to plant them when they're not quite dormant yet. That being said, really now is the perfect time for that, but you can do those in the spring just fine. But really, it's our trees and shrubs, especially a lot of our fruit trees, a lot of our fruit shrubs, blueberries, blackberries, any of our, loquats, things like that. Any of our fruit trees really should be planted right now. So there is still plenty to plant. There is actually still plenty to do, but the big thing is really going to be winter preparation. And I know I'm sure I'll always get the comments, well, we don't really have a winter, but for plants, we do. And so this is something we do want to be very aware of, that just because it's not necessarily that cold for us, it's still it's still going to be cool enough for these plants. So we really want to kind of get prepared for that, especially for some of our tender plants. So still lots to do. And of course, scouting, really right now, you're going to start to pay attention to your trees. Are they losing their leaves early? To some of your shrubs, are you seeing diseased leaves falling to the ground? And of course, starting to kind of prep and clean up based on that. So preparing for the winter is probably one of the biggest things. I'll go much more in depth on how to kind of protect things in the winter, what things you might need to bring in, what things you might not. But do kind of start to pay attention to the weather. Start to pay attention to the cooler nights. Say, all right, if I'm starting to see things below 40 degrees, I might be a little bit concerned, especially with some of your annuals, your tender annuals. Anything below 40 is usually going to be a little bit too cold for these. So this is really the time to start to pay attention to that. And of course, your vegetables, if you're like me and you're just insistent to keep summer vegetables in the ground until the absolute last second, kind of watch out for that. The best thing to do is, if you start to notice it's getting a little bit too cold for those things, go ahead and harvest everything you can, because once it gets hit by the frost and is done, that fruit sometimes won't be any good. So you want to get that off the plant as quick as possible. And of course, a lot of your annuals, if you are planning to bring any of your annuals in, start to get those things, those cuttings took, start to get those plants prepared, because things like coleus, unfortunately, aren't cold tolerant at all. So anything below 40 degrees will really knock them back. And if you get anything close to 32, they're done. So kind of just be prepared for that. I know it's still only November, and there's a lot of winter preparation that can be done before December, which is really when the start of winter is going to be for us. That being said, it's still something to keep on our minds. And of course, thinking about how are you going to protect these things. So I've got some tender trees, especially citrus for me, that I'm very concerned with. All right, can I overwinter it? Obviously, the best thing to do is to know the cold tolerance of the citrus that you have specifically. And of course, if it's one that isn't as cold tolerant, be prepared to protect it in some way. And obviously, we'll go a lot more in detail next month on kind of what to protect, how to protect, and things of that nature. Of course, your tender perennials as well. There's, just in case there's one that you want to treat as a perennial, you might need to protect it a little bit more over this winter. Hopefully it's not a severe winter, but you never know. They are calling for it. So just kind of be prepared. And of course, best thing to do, just keep an eye on the weather. Check the temperatures for the week and say, hey, you know what, that night looks a little bit cold. So now on the flip side, what can I do in the garden? Really the biggest thing, and I am guilty of this myself, but cleaning up the garden and cleaning up tools is such an important part of basically winterizing your garden. So any of your pruners, any of your shovels, any of your hose, sharpen your hose, sharpen your pruners, clean up your tools. This is really the time to go ahead and start packing things up. So I'm obviously still doing some planting, so not necessarily your shovels and your trowels, but my pruners. I'm not really doing much cutting. I'm not doing much deadheading. I'm going to kind of put everything away really until next February. So I'm going to go ahead and start putting things up, putting up lawn mowers. Generally, you're going to probably get your winter cut sometime towards the end of this month. Go ahead, check your blades, make sure they're fairly sharp, and clean them up, of course, if you need to. And of course, sharpen and clean any of your pruning blades. Again, for next year, because we're not really going to be using them a whole lot right now, with some exceptions, of course. And another big thing, and I know I've emphasized this before, and I'll emphasize this again, but a lot of your shrubs that have disease now, cleaning up around those plants and cleaning up the mulch and replacing those mulch, replacing whatever you can around those plants, it's going to really help decrease the prevalence of disease. One of the pictures I'm using here, that's a flower blight on a camellia. It's a fungal disease that affects camellias. It's one of those that sanitation is really going to be our best control for it. And so that's where the second those flowers fall, I'm going to clean those up and try to get them away from the plant as much as possible. So sanitation, absolutely important for this time of year. Really, this is now the time to go through the garden and say, you know what, I'm going to clean out that bed. I'm going to remulch it. I'm going to start getting things to look as kind of perfect as possible. Not perfect, but as nice as possible for this time of year. So as I mentioned last month, there are plenty of things to plant, and November is really kind of similar to October in what we can plant. We are getting a little bit late in the season for some of your less hardy annuals, like your snapdragons, glendules, dianthus. But that being said, you can still get a lot of those in the ground. A lot of times, if I have extra, I'll go ahead and throw them in the ground now. But that being said, a lot of your kind of hardier annuals can still be put in the ground as well. And kind of similar to your actual vegetables, your ornamental cabbage and kale can be planted right now. If you're like me, you like to keep lots of herbs in the ground. Not necessarily chives and coriander as much now, but dill and parsley can still be put in. And a big thing that I'm going to emphasize a lot probably this month as well as last month is cover cropping, because getting those seeds, those cover crop seeds, planted really November is the last chance. Once December hits, we're a little bit late in the season, so you have to kind of put those seeds away. That's something I still have to do myself. I've got raised beds that need to be cover cropped, and really I'm kind of waiting till those last few fruits come to harvest, and then I'm going to pull those off and go ahead and cover crop those beds. But cover cropping is something I really encourage to do at most of the time. Of course, as I mentioned, you can still plant a lot of your greens, though you're getting a little bit late in the season. Though I've planted lettuce through December and done just fine. That's a very quick crop. That being said, this is the month to plant garlic. So garlic is a relatively easy crop to grow. One thing I do encourage is to do it in raised beds if you can, or containers. It does like deep, rich soil and loose soil. That's kind of the big thing with those. One of the big things with garlic, no matter what, it does need to be consistently watered. It does not like to dry out. Another thing that I actually just got done doing is planting strawberry crowns. So if you grow strawberries, you can grow them as perennials, though disease problems become more and more prevalent the longer you keep them in the ground. If you're like me, I like to do them as annuals, and I just got the crowns planted, I would say about 2 weeks ago. November is really the perfect time to plant those. You can plant some of your garden peas now. I really prefer to wait kind of towards the end of November, or even wait till February. But garden peas are one of those that they don't mind the cooler weather. You just want to make sure it's in the ground and flowering. Of course, once it flowers, you tend to have to worry a little bit more about frost. So kind of keep that in mind. And of course, always watch for frost warnings, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. Frost is always something that you want to kind of be aware of. Though we don't get a hard frost here as you would in other places in the state. It's still something we want to kind of be aware of. And of course, this is the big thing, and I'm going to go through again how to plant. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to plant properly. But perennials and shrubs right now, and trees. This is a big thing. If you are wanting to incorporate any trees, which I encourage people to do anyways, go ahead and start getting them in the ground. This is the perfect month to do so. October is as well. But really, you want to do it because you want that tree to overwinter and really hit the spring running, getting established. That way, by the heat of the summer, I'm nowhere near as concerned with the water needs or anything like that. Those roots are really developed. Same with those shrubs and perennials. Um, Perennials a little bit less so. Those are a little bit more variable. You can really plant those almost at any time, though you have a lot more success if you don't plant it in the middle of the summer. But go ahead, start getting some of those shrubs in place. Go ahead and start replacing some of those dead shrubs or not so happy shrubs. That's a big thing to go ahead and do. Go ahead and start getting an idea of where everything should go. And of course, I'm definitely guilty of this, planting things in the wrong place. If it is in the wrong place, go ahead and move it now. This is kind of the perfect month to do so. That'll allow that plant time to really adjust to its new environment before the heat. So I always do this one whenever we're talking about planting, mostly because it's really important to discuss how to plant. And if anyone wasn't here last month, this is really just a quick overview to how to plant. If you were, I apologize for the repeat. But the idea is this is still something that I am going to find is very important, mostly because a lot of times people don't know how to plant, and that's going to affect long term the success of that planting. As always, as I said last time, planting is key. This is really the first step in a garden. Though you don't have to follow the plan to the T, it is still something you want to get a good idea. Hey, this is a good area for this. This is a good area for that. Be aware of how big that plant's going to get. Go ahead and start picking them out. And of course, right plant, right place. That is one of the most important concepts when it comes to planting. Obviously, you want whatever you plant to go in the perfect spot. You don't necessarily want it to go in a spot that is going to struggle at any point. And of course, always keeping a journal. This is something that helps me. And I encourage a lot of people, everyone I can, keep a journal. It really is helpful to kind of figure out, all right, what am I doing wrong? Because trust me, most of gardening is just trial and error, figuring out, all right, what am I doing wrong? How can I fix this? And what can I do better? And of course, how to plant. Big thing is first determine the location, as we just mentioned. Address any issues that may address themselves or that may present themselves right off the bat. So if I'm digging the hole, I notice it's got really poor drainage, it's really heavy clay. I notice, man, there's no organic matter in the soil. Adjust that, fix that, get a soil test first, adjust your pH, get things set up early before you plant anything in that hole. And of course, goes with the plant. Make sure that plant's got a good root system on it, but not necessarily pot bound. They tend to establish a lot better if they're not pot bound, especially for trees and shrubs. Make sure that plant is healthy before you buy it. That is one of the biggest things. Please inspect anything that you buy. Make sure it looks good, healthy. Check the roots, check the trunk, check the overall structure and everything like that, and the foliage as well. Of course, kind of keep in mind when we're planting, you need something to dig with, you need something to break up those roots with. Compost, water, and mulch. Very straightforward. As I said, I kind of already went over this last month. It's still a good refresher. And of course, first step, dig the hole twice as wide as it is deep. Really make sure that when you plant, that root ball is either level or a little bit above. This is very important. Do break up those roots first before you put it in the hole. The better you break up those roots, a lot of times, the better this plant's going to establish. So I really do encourage that. I do encourage people to amend the soil before they plant. But remember, we are filling that hole back in with the soil you pulled out. We are not bringing in brand new soil for each hole. That is not something that tends to allow for plants to establish properly. So kind of keep that in mind. Try to use as much of that native soil as possible. Again, compost is always your best friend. I really encourage lots of compost usage, and I always like to mulch the area after I'm done and water thoroughly. Watering is really important, even if it's been raining, your plant's already wet. When you water, you're not necessarily watering it to help. You are helping it overcome shock, but you're also watering it to help remove any air pockets, help settle that soil, help to kind of pack in that soil better versus having to stamp it in yourself. Um, One thing is some plants may need to be pruned after planting. Blueberries would be a good example of that. Most things don't, though. Really, the big thing is remove any flowers or fruits. And I kind of mentioned strawberries earlier. That's a big one for if you are going to be planting it this time of year. Make sure you're removing those flowers, so that way it puts all its energy into growth. And so that's kind of a big thing for that. Really, most of your anything that's going to be bearing fruit, you really want to remove those fruits when you plant. And of course, same with flowers, though that is a difficult one, especially if you're like me and want to be planting camellias right now, because I don't truthfully want to lose those flowers, but it does help root development to do so. And of course, where to plant, always keep in mind the basic necessities of how to plant, where to plant. Um, I'm not really going to focus too much on this because we have talked about this before. And there's always every plant's got its specific requirements. Please get to know that before you get that thing in the ground. A lot of times that solves a lot of your issues long before you ever come into them. Great example would be that Camellia japonica there. Obviously, I've actually made the mistake of planting it. When I planted it in the fall, planted it in full sun, had to move it because that thing just struggled. If I had picked the area properly ahead of time, I would have saved myself the trouble of having to dig it up and put it through more stress. So kind of keep that in mind, and keep in mind, check the drainage of your soil, check the drainage of that hole. That is very key. If you have an issue with flooding, if you have an issue with just water settling and not going anywhere, if you dig the hole and there's water in the hole, keep that in mind. You might need to dig high or plant higher. You might need to switch areas. Not a lot of plants really aren't going to like wet soil. So, all right, general care in the garden. This is kind of the big section. So one of the things I kind of want to address first is pruning or deadheading or cutting back. So for most of your plants, a lot of times you're really going to leave them be, let them overwinter. But that being said, there are things to kind of address first. You want to make sure you get the disease plants out, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Soil test. This is really the perfect time to do soil test. Big question would be, do I need lime or do I need sulfur? Do I need to adjust my pH? If I do need to adjust my pH, it takes time for a lime or sulfur to affect that pH overall. So if I have to put out lime, go ahead and get that out. You want to know and go ahead and get that out months before you have to actually plant things or have to do anything. Same with sulfur. These are things that take time to actually affect the pH of your soil. Really, really important to do. I really encourage soil test. No matter what, it does give you a good idea of what you need to fertilize with throughout the season. Get you a good idea if there's anything just really, really high, really, really low. This is a really good way to kind of get a feeling for what's going on chemically in your soil. So soil tests are very important. Really, right now is the perfect time to do so. Fertilizing, this is kind of a little bit different. Basically, if it's not a cool season annual, or if it's not an annual or a vegetable, I'm probably not doing much fertilizing this time of year. Now, a big thing that I'm probably going to avoid is nitrogen. So nitrogen obviously encourages new growth, so back off on that. Basically, applying some slow release fertilizer for your cool season annuals is about all I'm going to do. Everything else is kind of going to hold off unless you are really, really low on something like potassium or phosphorus. Generally, applying fertilizer this time of year is just not necessary. But that being said, compost is always useful this time of year. I like to add compost. I like to redo my beds, my vegetable beds, like you see there. I applied a layer of compost on top of that. That has now been cover cropped. Um, and I'll explain that in a second. But compost is just, I cannot emphasize, and I know I think I say this every month. Use lots of compost. It's such an excellent soil amendment. I think I use more compost than anything else in the garden. Probably more compost than I use fertilizer. Mostly because I find that if I can get that soil healthier, more fertile, happier, get more microorganisms growing and moving within that soil, my plants are going to find the nutrients they need a lot better. And that soil is going to hold what I need a lot better. So you're going to reduce a lot of that fertilizer requirements the more organic matter you can incorporate into your soil. A good way to incorporate that, as I mentioned, with cover crops. So cover cropping is a little bit difficult for kind of your general garden, but if you're like me, you grow vegetables, you grow annual crops like that. That cover cropping is an excellent way to kind of overwinter your soil. Basically, what you're doing is you're using a plant to trap the nutrients or add nutrients to that soil. And what it does is it feeds that soil, that feeds that microorganism group. Again, remember, soil is not just a growing medium, it is a living, breathing ecosystem, and it is one that we need to cultivate as well as cultivate our plants. Mulch, this is a key part of cultivating that healthy soil. We want to make sure that we have a good layer of mulch no matter what. Even if my plant's dormant, I want to have something covering that soil. I don't like bare soil is not something we should go for. We should have something either growing or protecting it in some way. Mulch is essential, of course, for a healthy garden. That's usually the very first thing the NRCS talks about when it talks about soil health is keeping something covering that soil to keep that soil healthy and happy. And of course, I encourage people to use organic mulches because that way you're slowly feeding the soil over time. And the good thing is even though it might get thin from over the summer, and of course, even this past fall, all I need to do is just add more. You're not pulling anything out, with the exception, of course, of diseased. If it's around diseased plants, it's a different story. But for most everything else, I'm just refreshing it. I'm not having to replace anything. This is a really good way to kind of reduce water needs, but it's a really good way to reduce weed pressure. The more you mulch, the more you keep those weeds down, the fewer weed problems you have going forward, because this protects that soil in that way. Obviously, water is nowhere near as much of a concern this time of year, mostly because as things cool down, plants' water needs are getting less. And so I'm not as concerned with that. But of course, mulch is still important to keep things from drying out completely. Weeding is something to be worried about. Even though it is starting to cool down, your summer weeds are on their way to being dead or dormant. I'm seeing a lot of winter weeds popping up, whether it's poania in your yard, whether it is Florida betony in your flower beds, which I can tell you I have an excellent crop of Florida betony this year, which means that I'm going to need to be weeding. Because unfortunately, something like Florida betony, it is a perennial. Really, the only way to control it outside of herbicide is to pull it consistently. But keep in mind those tubers that they have in the soil, if they break off, they will regerminate a new plant. But if you do get it out, they are edible and actually quite tasty. So kind of keep that in mind. But Florida betony is definitely one that I'm running into a lot right now, mostly because my summer weeds are dying. And I don't have a whole lot of issue with my winter weeds outside of Florida betony. One thing, if you do have a home lawn, prevention is going to be the key for weeds. So if you use something like a pre-emergent herbicide, or if you're just using proper cultural practices, unfortunately this time of year, not really much to do unless these weeds are already popping up, then you have to treat. But if you're not that worried about it, if you're saying, you know what, at least I have something green growing, leave it be. Because a lot of times, remember, though weeds can take nutrients or water away from plants, they are really just the wrong plant in the wrong place, not necessarily bad. And so a lot of times we don't need to overdo it in our weed control. But do keep in mind water concerns, especially during the winter. If we're not getting a lot of rain, you might need to be a little bit concerned with those weeds if you're not giving it excess water, because they can take water away from your plant's existing. Of course, pruning, this is a big one. So I know I mentioned last week or last month about ceasing your deadheading of roses to allow those hips to hips to form, and of course the plants to harden off. I'm actually probably going to cease deadheading most of my plants. I'm going to really cease any type of pruning. One of the big things I'm probably going to do right now is I'm going to go through and I'm going to look, do I have any diseased annuals? I'm pulling them out. If I have any diseased perennials, I'm cutting it back. Basically, I'm going through and cleaning up disease and leaving really just about everything else. Mostly because a lot of times leaving those plants going dormant is really good, not only for our native pollinators, but as well as our native wildlife. And so it is kind of a good practice. Don't necessarily feel like you need to sterilize the yard every time. I just recommend getting the disease out, leave the rest. And of course, really that's about the only pruning I'm really doing this time of year. I'm getting that last mow down, cleaning up some of the leaves around the yard. But outside of that, basically I let everything go into winter on its own. All we are really here to do is to help it along its way. And pruning is one of those things that I'm probably going to hold off doing much of. If you do have any trees that need pruning, keep in mind you can do pruning with trees. Once they're fully dormant, do wait until they're dormant to do so then. Watering, same concept. Obviously, it's getting cooler. My water needs are really, really going down. That being said, I don't want plants to sit there and completely dry out, even during the winter, because that can cause issues in the roots, that can cause stress, and that can cause plants to struggle when they try to come out of dormancy in the spring. And so really, this is where monitoring your rain gauge, monitoring how much water have you been getting, putting out in the garden. If you have any annuals or vegetables, I do encourage to continue watering those consistently. Most everything else, though, monitor and make sure that you're getting generally 1 inch per week is the ideal amount, especially during the winter. It really depends on the plant. A lot of your plants, again, need to make sure you're not letting them dry out completely. One thing I will say, especially with the onset of winter, a well-watered plant overwinters a lot better than a dry plant. And a big one is citrus. If a citrus, there's two things with citrus. If it has fruit on it, or if it is just under some drought stress, its cold tolerance is greatly reduced. So do make sure you are watering consistently especially with any plants that are going to have some concern as far as cold tolerance goes. And obviously, as with most things, avoid overhead irrigation as much as possible. So there are some problems to run into right now. Probably the biggest one I'm seeing pop up is scale. So I'm seeing T-scale on camellias. I'm seeing scale on hollies, as you see in this picture. You're starting to see some scale. Those are really the insects of concern this time of year. But scouting is really important. As I always say, even during the dead of winter, still monitor your plants. Make sure your plants are healthy. Make sure your plants are happy. And make sure you don't allow anything to get out of hand. And so disease is going to be a lot harder to ID this time of year as things go dormant. But kind of watch for things and see, did I notice a plant struggling towards the end of the year? Did it go dormant a little early? This is going to be especially true for our trees. So this is something we definitely want to pay attention to. Though insect populations are decreasing, it's still a concern, again, especially for scale, as you see with this very infested Camellia japonica. I want to say japonica. It's definitely something to be a little bit worried about. Obviously, you're not seeing turf pest nearly as much. Usually you're seeing the damage, but that's about it. Sooty mold, if you had insects, sooty mold is definitely the problem, or is definitely a problem that you have to pay attention to. If you have sooty mold and you don't see the insect, chances are the insect's done for the year. But this is a good time to kind of treat for that. And it's especially a good time to treat for scale. If you do have any vegetables in the ground, do continue watching for those Lepidoptera pests, those caterpillar pests on your cabbage, your kale, your broccoli, your cauliflower, if they're still in the ground. And of course, there are some disease issues. I'm seeing disease in turf, so please be aware of that. If you do see this, it's usually at its peak this time of year in turf. If you have it, you probably need to treat for it, and you probably need to turn around and treat again next spring. So do kind of watch out for that. Probably the biggest one, of course, being large patch for most of your St. Augustine and centipede lawns. I am seeing some dieback on shrubs and perennials. It really depends. Though unfortunately we haven't had much rain. The problem is rain doesn't always equal Phytophthora and Pythium. It's usually the stress in the irrigation, of course, we're adding is just enough. The stresses is something that we have to watch out for. So if you're seeing dieback, please pay attention to that and address it accordingly. And of course, a big thing, as I mentioned with trees, look for premature defoliation. If you have crepe myrtles that are defoliating early, if you have, I'm trying to think of other trees, a dogwood like in this picture with its anthracnose on there, this is a good indication that that tree was under stress, had some disease. That's where you're going to follow that cleanup, that sanitation process where I'm going to clean up around it. I'm going to get it remulched. And of course, I'm going to turn around and see what I need to do to address it next spring. So kind of watch out for that. I am seeing Cercospora on pretty much everything right now, whether it's ligustrums, whether it's hydrangeas, whether it's crepe myrtles. Cercospora is definitely a concern. And of course, anthracnose on my dogwoods, if you have any dogwoods planted. But do kind of pay attention to that. Premature defoliation is something to watch out for. If it is something that happens, maybe that's a plant you need to keep in your journal and say, hey, that's one I need to watch a little bit more next year. And of course, as I did with so far with the past couple months, I did want to mention again, in integrated pest management, remember the happier and healthier your plant is, the less problems you generally have. So kind of keep that in mind. This is something that when we talk about controlling pest disease, we want to make sure that we are involving all the different ecological concepts that go into gardening, period. And a really good example is this picture here. That was a bed that was infested with root knot nematode. And so what we did was we planted it with marigolds. And of course, had to keep that planted with marigolds until we stopped seeing the nematode problem. So that's just an example. That's a biological control. There are a lot of different types of control. Do encourage you to kind of follow that process. If you are more interested in it, please let me know. But it's really the main goal is to keep chemical as the last resort. And so as you can see, cultural control is always first, mechanical, biological, and then chemical. These are all things that can be utilized. Again, we want to look at that entire toolbox and see what we have. Dormant oil. So this is one I wanted to mention real quick because guess what? I just talked about scale. I just talked about sooty mold. The best control for a lot of these pests is going to be dormant oil, also known as horticultural oil. This is going to be different than neem oil. Horticultural oil is a very effective pest control method for sap-sucking insects like whiteflies, scale, mealybugs, aphids, you name it. This is a big one to use, especially if you have camellias with scale right now. You definitely want to get in there and treat for that scale, the T-scale. If you have gardenias that have had issues, keep in mind you probably need to do kind of a preventative spray in the spring to avoid some of those whitefly issues. And of course, if you're seeing any of your other sap-sucking insects, this is one that I encourage people to use just not only as a preventative, but as a treatment, because again, it's one of the safest and most effective methods we can use to control a lot of these things. And of course, as I mention every time, here's kind of some examples of disease and insect and mite control that we have in our toolbox. These are kind of the safest products. And so kind of keep that in mind. Horticultural oil is one of my go-tos. And of course, if you're like me and have disease problems, copper is going to be one of the more effective, though sulfur is almost as effective. Neem oil, much less so. So that is all I have for today. As I said, November isn't as exciting. One of the nice things about November is you can kind of enjoy some of the wonderful things kind of around the garden. You can start to see some of that fall color, those fall flowers, and of course, a lot of things come to fruition. So I'm going to go ahead and take your questions. All right. So first question is, how cold hardy are geraniums? Relatively not. I think that's the wrong way to put it. They're really not cold hardy at all. I tend to treat geraniums if I am worried about a frost, I'm either going to bring them inside or I've already propagated them and I'm overwintering them inside already. This is not one that if you get any chance of a frost, geraniums are going to be done. And that's the same with Wandering Jew. That is one that I generally don't see it as being super cold hardy. So kind of keep that in mind. Really, neither of those are cold hardy enough for me to consider any type of cold hardiness. If that makes sense. Should I rake up? So Andy asked, should I rake up deciduous leaves from beds with shrubs and perennials or leave them on until spring for beneficial insects and birds? That is an excellent question. And so when it comes to leaves, anything that drops from these plants, as I mentioned, really with the exception of diseased leaves or foliage, I'm going to leave as much of that on the ground in the beds as possible. I'm not even going to leave them until spring. I'm going to leave them indefinitely. And though it doesn't always look as clean and tidy as people want, those leaves are some of the best type of mulch you can ask for. And it's natural. It comes from the plants already. Those plants are essentially hoping to recycle those fallen leaves, any of that debris that has hit the ground, because that debris is going to be utilized by the microorganisms, which are then going to help feed the soil, which helps feed the roots, which helps feed the actual plant that dropped that in the first place. If you are constantly raking up, you are pulling something away from that cycle. And so I do encourage you to leave as much of that debris as possible. And it is really important both for the beneficial insects and especially for the birds. That is one thing I like to see. If I have lots of leaf fall, I tend to see a lot of things like thrashers going around, getting all the insects out of there. Definitely very helpful to keep that in there. Obviously, if you have a lawn, you can mow that lawn to keep those leaves chopped up. But generally, I'm going to leave as much of that as possible. I'm not going to remove it. I see the Mix America mustard in one of your slides. I would encourage everyone to plant that. It is absolutely fabulous. Much prettier than other mustards. You can't find it everywhere, but interesting. That is good to know. I am a big fan. Mustard is a fun one to grow. I would definitely concur with that, and I appreciate. I will definitely keep that in mind to utilize that one. Can African iris be cut back? So I would probably hold off on cutting it back right now. I would probably let it go dormant before I do so. So keep in mind a lot of that foliage up top is going to go dormant. So I'm really going to wait until that happens. I'm going to try to avoid cutting anything that's living right now. So yes, you can cut it back. I would just wait probably till the end of the month or till your first frost. Why do we want the root ball top slightly of the soil top? That is an excellent question. So the reason why I generally prefer that root ball to be slightly above the ground around it is first off, that soil mix that root system is growing in is lighter than your native soil. So it is going to settle, it is going to sink, but also because we tend to have heavier soils, I want to make sure that that root system is able to still go. We don't have deep soils naturally. So I want that root system to still be able to go down and out as much as possible. But really it's because that thing is going to settle naturally. And the one thing I do not ever want to do is plant too deep. In fact, I have planted plenty of things much higher than what I just talked about and have been extremely successful. Anytime I plant completely level, I usually get some sinkage and it causes issues further down the road. So I do encourage planting slightly above the ground around it, mostly because, again, we do have fairly heavy soils. Drainage is usually a concern, so kind of keep that in mind. Do you suggest biotone when planting? So I don't tend to fertilize. That is a good question. I don't tend to fertilize much when I plant. That being said, biotone is not a bad one to utilize. One of the things I always recommend when you are planting, I would either do it before you plant or after you plant, not during, if that makes sense. Now, mostly because when it comes to fertilizer and planting, I'm always a little concerned because those roots are very tender. I am trying to encourage new roots to grow. And so fertilizer sometimes can cause problems with that. And so the best thing to do is go ahead when you are mending that hole, when you're mending that soil before you plant, add the biotone then, or turn around once the plant's planted and it's watered in and settled in, maybe go ahead and add it then. I just prefer not to add it in the hole if you are going to use it. I don't tend to add fertilizer, but if you do, just don't add it in the hole. All right, so I propagated beautyberry shrub from a cutting, but the plant is still small, even though this is the time to plant shrubs. Should I wait? So that is a really good question, actually, Carol. And though, yes, it is the best time to plant shrubs, that beautyberry, just because it's a fairly new plant in regards to its lifespan, because you just propagated it, I'm probably going to overwinter it by either protecting it outdoors or bringing it inside. That's probably what I'm going to plant in the spring because I want it to put on a little bit more growth. I want those roots to develop a little bit more before I put it in the ground. Because again, you just propagated that, so kind of keep that in mind. So that would kind of be an exception to that. I would probably wait until the spring to plant that. Dormant oil does not necessarily work on Japanese beetles. Japanese beetles are a difficult one to control, but the good news is they don't generally become an issue until May and June. And usually by that point, we can address kind of all the other things that you can do with that. There is one method to control Japanese beetles right now, and that is using something like milky spore. And what that is that's a grub control. And so that's actually, you are inoculating your soil with a beneficial, I believe it's a bacteria that is actually going to help control those grubs, which are the larvae form of the Japanese beetles. If you are going to utilize that, you probably do need to use it a couple years. I'm not exactly sure the exact time to put out milky spore, but that would be the proper way to control Japanese beetles, because if you control the larvae, you control the adult. Sorry, Ms. American, good to know. What caused my flamingo to not bloom this summer, and will it come back next year? That all depends, Cheryl, on the winter, really. Plumbago, for the most part, kind of acts as a perennial. Mine didn't bloom this summer very much, and I think a lot of it had to do with, we just had such a weird, it rained a bunch, then it didn't rain for a while, and then it rained a bunch. And I think plumbago didn't really love that. It's a very easy plant to grow for the most part. Usually the less you do, the better. But I found that this year was not really a great year for plumbago, but I should expect it to come back next year. And chances are, once you've cut it back in the spring, it should flush out and hopefully do a lot better now that it's been in the ground for a bit. So you've got, and he's got a small plastic flat greenhouse ordered. Um, should I get a heated seed mat or a really small space heater with a thermostat on it? If so, what temperature would you set it at? Okay, that is a really good question. So I do encourage you to get a small heater or a heating mat, something to provide heat during the cool, cold nights. That being said, really, you don't want the temperature inside something like that to get below, I would probably say 65. The idea is those plants are going to be the happiest if it's above 65. That being said, probably the ideal temperature for most of those is going to be around 80. But because this is kind of a prefab greenhouse with something like a space heater, it would probably be very difficult to kind of control that perfectly. And so I would probably make your goal around 70, 75, because that way it's not too hot, but it's not too cold. Can you address the value of row covers? Interesting question. So row covers is a method of controlling insects. And basically, it's creating a cover over plants so that way it stops, say, the moths from getting into the plant or getting there and laying eggs on the plant. It is utilized especially for lepidopteran pests. I have seen it used for other pests as well. I have to admit, it's not one that I have utilized myself, but row covers are an effective method, especially in organic gardening and organic agriculture. It is one of those that it does take some work on your part. And of course, making sure that you have kind of the proper methods, putting it out at the right time. And if you're utilizing it for anything that's going to produce fruit, be aware that you might need to help pollination because you're not only preventing the bad bugs, but you're preventing the good as well. So there is a lot of value for row covers. It is not one I have a whole lot of experience with, but I have seen it work very successfully. And of course, obviously, that's probably not the perfect answer for that, mostly because, again, I haven't worked with row covers. I do think it's something worth trying if you do have a problem with pests. And then last question is, how cold hardy are crotons? They are really not that cold hardy. That is probably something that I'm going to try to protect in the winter. Not necessarily bringing them inside, though bringing them inside is going to be the best protection for them. They're actually fairly shade tolerant and probably can be brought inside fairly well. They're also drought tolerant. But that being said, if I can protect them as much as possible, I have seen them overwinter just fine in unheated coverings. But again, it really depends on the winter. But that is one I'm not going to treat as a super cold hardy plant. I'm probably going to protect it as much as possible, especially in a pot. Because remember, in a pot, that soil is going to cool down a lot quicker. And so really keep that in mind. I'm probably going to try to get that under some cover, protect it, maybe even bring it inside. So I think that's all the questions. Obviously, if anyone's got anything else, please do not hesitate to give me a call, email me, let Kyle know if you've got any other questions. I really do appreciate everyone joining me tonight. As always, it's always fun to talk about what to do in the garden. And of course, hopefully I will see everyone again next month.